Hey there, it's Jason Gorman from Codemanship with another video diary update. It's Thursday morning, it's not even 7 o'clock yet, but I thought I'd share some thoughts about something that's been on my mind for the last couple of days. I've been thinking a lot about software design processes, and there's a lot that can go wrong with the design process. But one of the things I see going wrong more often, in fact, more often than it goes right, is something that I attribute to what some people call solution bias. Solution bias is when someone, a team or an inventor or a designer, has come up with a solution to a problem, and then that kind of gets stuck in their head. And then after they've come up with that solution, they become very attached to it. And they try to sort of steer the requirements to fit the solution rather than steering a solution to fit the requirements. In particular, I see this happening because in a lot of software development processes, the design part of it is driven by specifications of a solution rather than descriptions of a business problem or a user problem to solve. When I teach test-driven development, and we get into the whole discussion of how do we drive a design in a test-driven way, we do an exercise where people work in pairs, and one of them is the customer, and one is the developer, although they'll both end up being developers in the end. And they have a think about a real-world problem they think might be solved, could be solved, potentially with a simple piece of software. And I'm very clear to them to just think about the problem, just describe the problem. For example, where I live, it's very, very hard to get vegan Chinese food. So that's a problem. At the moment a solution pops into your head, an app for getting vegan Chinese food or whatever the solution is, all of a sudden you're thinking about the solution and not about the problem. So my approach to design always starts with a description of a problem that we're trying to solve. And we're always coming back to that problem. That's my definition of done. It's not, was a solution delivered, or were features delivered, or did it pass the acceptance tests? It's, did we actually solve the customer's problem? And that's usually going to involve multiple iterations, multiple go-arounds, starting with the simplest solution we think could solve the problem. And then we get that out there into the real world, tested with real users ideally, or in a simulation of the real world if it's too dangerous or expensive to test it in the real world, so that we can get feedback from real use. Now, in many approaches to design, let's take, for example, many agile approaches, people think of requirements as being things like user stories, but user stories typically are descriptions of features they want the software to have. So at that point, we are actually thinking about a solution. We're thinking about building a product rather than solving a problem. And there are many teams who talk about product focus as a high level of maturity. And for sure, it's a higher level of maturity than just delivering a list of features. But it's still not the real level of maturity you need in a design process. A design process should be about solving the problem. NASA, for the moon landings, didn't pat themselves on the back because they delivered the rockets as specified. They patted themselves on the back because they delivered 3 astronauts to the surface of the moon and brought them back safely. They solved the problem. And that's the real definition of done. So here's the thing with solution bias. It can be very, very persistent once it's taken hold, once it's in the back of our minds. I once worked on a project with a well-known consulting firm who had a dozen or so developers on a team working for a company in London. And they were writing an application for some kind of shipping application. I won't say the business space they were in, but it was shipping things. And they were tracking those shippings. And when I arrived on the project as an independent contractor, they'd already been there for several months. And I discovered that they had been building an entity relationship framework for .NET with the client's money. It solved none of the client's problem, and there were already entity relationship or object relational mapping frameworks available that worked perfectly well, but they were determined to build theirs, and they built it with the client's money. And I quickly realized that all of our discussions about requirements with the business analysts working for the client were being steered towards, but what about this open source framework? But what about this open source framework? So it all became about a solution. that had nothing to do with the problem, nothing to do with shipping this particular kind of product. So I've always been very, very wary, been very mindful of when I arrive on a project, I check out the requirements and go, are these business requirements, or is this a description of a solution? Are we setting out to build a solution here, or are we setting out to solve a problem? And if it's the former, if we've got solution bias, 9 times out of 10 I will throw those requirement specifications in the bin and go back to the real customer if I get the chance. Doesn't always make me a lot of friends. There are a lot of people who have invested, business analysts and product owners and architects and user experience designers and those kinds of people who are invested in a design for a solution. But if I can't figure out what problem we're trying to solve, and very importantly, how we'll know if we've solved it, then I treat the requirements with a great deal of suspicion. I look at them as a solution specification, not a set of requirements. And that takes effort. It's taken me many, many years to kind of rewire my brain. I get solution bias just like everybody else. When I work on things, I can find myself working for hours and hours trying to make something work, when what I should do, and this is a very powerful thing, by the way, here's a real tip. When you're up against it and the clock is ticking, you're thinking, we're not going to make it, we're not going to make it, we're not going to be able to deliver this thing, step back and go, but do we? Do we need to deliver this thing? Is this the only way of solving this problem? Or is there a simpler way? I was very influenced in my early career by a chap called Tom Gilb, who wrote a book on software engineering project management that was published in the late 1980s. And a lot of people, I think quite rightly, attribute Tom as one of the sort of the forebears of the movement for agility, for true iterative development. A lot of teams, when they say they're doing iterative development, what they're actually doing is just incrementally delivering a feature set. They're working through a plan, perhaps working through it in an unpredictable way, but they're working through a plan, a backlog or a feature list. To me, iterating means small feedback loops, learning with each loop, moving towards a goal, solving a problem. So it's iterative, to me, is goal seeking. It's about solving a problem, and each path that you take should get you closer to solving the problem until the problem is solved, my definition of done. And this approach, this evolutionary approach to software design and development, was described very well by Tom in the late 80s and has been described many times by him since. And I was taken by a story that he told me about a piece of work he did for the Department of Defense, I think it was, in the United States, where they had this multi-million-pound project that was all about emails and prioritizing emails up the chain of command so that the right emails got to the right commanders at the right time and so on. And they'd make this really complicated set of requirements, and it was all going very badly, and it was all well behind schedule. And he went in and said, well, what problem were we trying to solve? And they described the end problem of that the general has so many people beneath them sending emails that stuff's not getting to them. It's all bit that, they can't see the wood for the trees. And he went and he read the documentation for their email solution, and it turned out there was a flag for that. There was a little button you could press in the configuration that would make it do that. No one had thought to ask. They were all so focused on delivering this solution, and I see it so many times. And it ends up being very, very expensive. Very expensive when we fixate on delivering a solution. And it's not just in software. We can see governments right now trying to fight the spread of this virus who become fixated on a particular solution. The President of the United States, for example, is fixated on a particular medicine for which apparently there's no evidence that it helps. But he's fixated on it now. He's got it at the back of his mind, oh, this will help. And we see it in Britain, and we see it in many countries, that they get this bee in their bonnet about this solution is going to work and we're going to try and make the problem fit the solution. So when it comes to design, you need to be always going back to the problem. Software development works best when it begins and ends in the real world with a real problem for real end users. And you should spend as much time there. You should revisit that as often as possible. The best way to revisit it is to deliver working software to those end users and watch them try to solve their problem and learn lessons from that and then go around again. It works very well. I've seen it work many times very, very well. The effects can be quite profound, and the end solutions often turn out to be very, very different from the ones that we originally envisaged. So solution bias, it's a bad thing, it's a damaging thing, it's a psychological, it's kind of one of these psychological things that we have that is bred into us, if you like. It's innate. And so we have that failing, that flaw in our thinking, and you need to watch for it very, very carefully. Okay, until the next update, stay indoors, stay safe. We're going to be here for some time, I think, and I suspect you will too, so there'll be more video updates coming.